But something in his posture, the almost imperceptible clenching in his eyes, the slight catching of his breath, indicated that the memories were still sharp, still close to the surface. Only 2 names came out of that zone, Hayes continued, his voice carrying far enough for the gathered crowd to hear. 2 out of 7. The other survivor never walked again, medically discharged 2 months later, passing away from complications in 2013. He paused, studying the man standing before him in ceremonial dress, seeing the soldier beyond the red tunic and polished brass. "That means you are the last living member of 9R Echo," still drawing breath. The silence that followed felt as if the entire world had held its breath. Even the distant sounds of London traffic seemed muffled, as if the city itself was listening to something it didn't quite comprehend but knew was profoundly important. Hayes now turned to the group of cadets, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent too many years explaining why good men died for reasons that would never make headlines. "To those of you from abroad," he said, his words precise and measured. "This man's uniform may seem like theater to you. You may think it's ceremonial, decorative, a relic from a time when wars were fought with swords and honor, not satellites and hashtags." He gestured towards hidden emblem, the faded green patch barely visible beneath his glove. "But some uniforms carry stories that are never told. Some carry souls that are never buried. And that patch you joked about isn't a decoration. It was issued in the back of a supply truck, 6 hours before a mission that never made the news, that has no Wikipedia page, that won't be made into a movie or a book, that received no grateful thanks from a grateful nation." His gaze now found Jones, not exactly angry, just filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "Lieutenant, when you question this man's worth, you mocked an insignia earned in total darkness, in a zone that officially never existed. You mocked the last survivor of a unit that did work most of your nation's generals never knew existed, and work most of your nation's citizens would never wish to know existed." Jones's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The self-assurance had completely vanished, replaced by a young officer's sudden, painful realization that he had blundered into waters far deeper than he had ever imagined. One of the young cadets, an Air Force ROTC kid no older than 19, whispered, "9R Echo. I thought that was just rumors, stories people told," another murmured. "They were deactivated after the explosion." "Wait, that was real?" Hayes's voice cut through the whispers like a knife. "Let me tell you what that patch means," he said, his words carrying the authority of one who had signed too many death certificates and written too many letters to parents who would never see their children again. "Because apparently, no one has taught you that some things are more important than the stories you tell about them." The courtyard suddenly felt smaller, as if the buildings themselves leaned in to listen, as if history pressed close, demanding that every word be heard and remembered. 9R Echo was unofficial, Hayes began. They weren't supposed to exist. There were no social media posts, no homecoming parades, no medal ceremonies, just a designation on classified orders and flight manifests with redacted assignments. He paused, allowing that to fully sink in. They were deployed under Operation Marfold into Helmand Province in 2008, buried so deep in Joint Task Force operations that most of the command staff didn't even know they existed. The silence was now absolute. Even the pigeons had ceased to move. Their job was route clearance, Hayes continued. Each word measured and decisive, quiet insertions into enemy territory. Permanent solutions to problems that couldn't be addressed by conventional forces, by conventional tactics, or by public accountability. They went in first. They cleared what needed clearing, and they disappeared before anyone could ask troubling questions about methods or collateral damage. He looked at Ward again, standing rigid in his ceremonial posture, and a sense of reverence seemed to infuse his voice. Quarter Blackwood was a 4-kilometer stretch of road through Tarin Valley that NATO convoys used to transport supplies between forward operating bases. Intelligence said the insurgents had mined it, set up ambush positions every 200 meters, emplaced hide cells with overlapping fields of fire. A 200-vehicle convoy full of medical supplies and winter gear was slated to use that route in 36 hours. Hayes's voice carried the weight of one who had read too many casualty reports, signed too many death certificates, made too many calls to families who would never be whole again. Sergeant Michael Ward's unit went in to clear that road. 7 men. Against an estimated 40 insurgents in prepared positions. There was no air support. Everything was tied up in a major operation happening 2 provinces away. There was no backup, no extraction plan, no room for error. A pause that felt like a prayer. They never made it out. Hayes gestured to the man in the red tunic, still standing at perfect attention despite the weight of memory, the heat, and the eyes of strangers. His team was exposed halfway through the clearance operation when the local guide turned out to be working for the other side. They lost the element of surprise, they lost their advantage, they lost all hope of quietly completing the mission. Air support was still tied up elsewhere, communications were severed, and extraction was impossible. The German cadet who had tried to stop Marcus Jones earlier now stood at rigid attention, his face pale with understanding. One of the French cadets had tears welling in her eyes. They retreated to a shattered compound. Perhaps once a school, or a clinic, or someone's home before the war made such distinctions meaningless. 5 men. They'd already lost 2 in the initial contact against waves of insurgents who knew the area and had nothing to lose. Hayes's voice softened, dropping to a more personal tone, as if sharing something painful to recall. They held that compound for 31 hours. 5 men with limited ammunition, food, water, and no hope of rescue. When QRF finally managed to punch through the enemy lines, only 2 bodies were still moving. One was unconscious, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds that should have killed him hours ago. The other was dragging him towards the remaining portion of the outer wall. He now looked directly at Ward, seeing beyond the ceremonial uniform to the man who had lived through hell and chosen to keep living. That man, the one you called a toy soldier, carried his team leader 80 yards through broken concrete and sustained fire. Then he went back to retrieve the radio equipment to call in an airstrike, because someone had to call in the airstrike that would level the area. Then he went back one more time to retrieve the wounded interpreter who, once again, was loyal when loyalty meant death. The silence was so complete that even breathing sounded loud. He went back into that collapsed building 3 times, under enemy fire, with insurgents closing in from 3 sides. He went back because that's what soldiers do when it means more than a paycheck, more than a uniform, and more than a story to tell at parties. Hayes turned to the cadets, his voice carrying the weight of every funeral he'd attended, every flag he'd folded, every widow he'd comforted. After the dust settled, the bodies were counted, and the reports were written in language that made horror sound like policy. 9R Echo was officially quietly decommissioned. The kind of decommissioning that happens in offices with no windows, with conversations that are never recorded. He paused, surveying the young faces before him. The survivors were assigned to separate units, separate bases, separate contents. One was medically discharged within 6 months, because it became clear his body would never recover from what it had been through. The other. Hayes looked at Ward's perfectly pressed uniform, his ceremonial rifle, his absolute stillness despite the heat, the scrutiny, and the weight of unwanted attention. The other requested assignment to ceremonial duties, not because he wanted recognition, an easy assignment, or a safe place where no one was shooting, but because he understood that protecting this place, this tradition, this symbol, this idea of what we are supposed to represent, held meaning for the men who would never make it home. The silence that followed was different from the ceremonial silence. This was a silence that carried weight, that carried the presence of the dead, a silence in which you understood why some men chose to stand still rather than move forward. One of the French cadets raised her hand lightly, as if a student asking permission to speak in a class too important to interrupt. "Sir," she said quietly, her accent making the words sound more formal, more considered. "Why would someone who did all that, choose to stand silently here, when he could tell his story, when he could be recognized for what he did?" Hayes's expression softened slightly, as it does when someone asks the right question but doesn't quite understand why it's the right one. "Because, ma'am, in silence, no one can edit the story. No one can reduce what happened to a sound bite, to a headline, or to a hashtag that trends for 3 days and then is forgotten. No one can applaud for the cameras or give speeches about sacrifices they never made. The men we lost. Sometimes silence is the only way to carry them properly, to honor what they gave without cheapening it." He looked at the faded patch of fabric still barely visible beneath Ward's glove, and his voice quieted further. "And some insignias were never meant to be seen. Only remembered, only carried, only honored in a silence that speaks louder than any medal ceremony, any parade, or any grateful thanks from a grateful nation." On London's proudest parade ground, an unknown insignia on a silent soldier's chest. How did it reveal itself to be the last witness to a battle hidden for years? Why did a young lieutenant's taunts freeze a world-weary general at the sight of a silent soldier's eyes? What was the secret of that old, faded insignia on his chest that silenced the entire square? Do you want to know if true power lies in the gleam of a uniform or in unseen sacrifices? At that moment, everyone thought they were witnessing an ordinary ceremony. But no one knew that today, the silent stance of the last soldier to survive a forgotten hell would reveal a terrifying truth from the dusty pages of history. Each of us would see how arrogance turns into bitter regret, and how respect is written in blood. This enigma will keep you glued to your screen until the last second. Quarter Blackwood, Tarin Valley, Unit C7. Sergeant Michael Ward's silent, yet firm reply cut through Jones's buffoonery. General Hayes revealed that behind this name stood the last survivor of Unit C7, a shadowy unit with horrific casualties, not documented in any official records. Michael Ward stood there for the memory of his lost comrades. His silent posture was proof that some stories speak louder than words, screams, or even medals. This was the embodiment of true strength, dignity, and unwavering discipline. If the stories of such silent heroes are important to you too, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notification bells so you don't miss any powerful stories. Show your support for invisible heroes like Michael Ward by liking this video. The July sun in London drenched the polished stones and bronze embellishments of the Horse Guards parade ground in light. It was a sight that made tourists pull out their cameras, eager to immortalize every moment. Red tunics, black bearskin hats, and the Royal Guards standing silently as if time had frozen. Each one was like a statue, seemingly enchanted to remain motionless despite the surging flow of life around them in London. But behind these statues lay a past hidden from everyone, known to very few. Sergeant Michael Ward stood in the second row of the solemn formation, second from the front. He was 38, a decade, perhaps more, older than the other guards. His face bore the marks of years spent squinting under the desert sun, sleeping in places sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold. His cheekbones were like a map of that harsh life. The scar on his neck was visible only to those who knew what a fragmentation injury looked like. A thin white line running towards his hairline, a remnant of being too close to an explosion. These marks were a burden he carried silently. Tourists were captivated by this precision, this silence. But few could sense how Ward held his rifle with the muscle memory of weapons that had fired back in real battles, or how he had learned to remain calm, his breathing steady, even when everything was falling apart. They only saw the show. That afternoon, amidst the usual crowd, there was also a group who should have known better. Dozens of young military cadets from a NATO exchange program gathered near the roped-off barrier. Their voices carried the self-assured confidence of young men who thought they understood everything. Most were American, mixed with a few French and German uniforms. Guiding them was Second Lieutenant Marcus Jones. Jones looked young enough to struggle with shaving his beard, and still unaccustomed to wearing the insignias he'd earned from West Point. He considered himself superior to everyone in this field. "Look at them," Jones said, without even bothering to lower his voice as he targeted the guards. "Wind-up toys. I bet they haven't touched the real rifle in years. They probably don't even know which end the bullets come out of." One of his cadets, a lanky kid from Tennessee, laughed and aimed his phone at Ward. "This guy hasn't even blinked since he got here. Do you think they get programmed in the morning?" Michael Ward didn't react. He couldn't even if he wanted to. But his stillness unnerved the smarter ones in the group. One of the German cadets, older than the rest, shifted his weight with the posture of someone who had seen military service and whispered, "Maybe we should show some respect." "Relax." Jones cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "They can't hear us. Besides, someone needs to tell them what real soldiers look like. Our guys are doing live fire drills back home. These guys are playing dress-up for a camera crew." The French cadets had fallen silent, their earlier enthusiasm turning into something resembling embarrassment. One of them, a lieutenant-ranked girl who looked like she came from a military family, quickly whispered something urgent in French to her companion. But Jones was on a roll now. He had spotted something that widened his grin further. A piece of fabric peeking out from under Ward's left glove. Dark green, with frayed edges. Definitely not regulation. It looked old, worn, as if it had seen things far beyond ceremonial duty. "Look at this," he said, approaching the rope and raising his voice. "Is that a band? What is that? A good luck charm? Maybe his girlfriend gave him a friendship bracelet to remember her by?" His voice carried across the stone courtyard, attracting the attention of other tourists. Michael Ward remained frozen, his breathing controlled like one who had learned to stay calm even when everything was falling apart. Jones turned to his group, smiling. "You know what this is? This is what happens when an army becomes a museum exhibit. Real soldiers are out there doing operations, doing real military work. These guys are standing here dressed up like Napoleon's backup dancers." Laughter rippled through some of the cadets. Not all. The German who had spoken earlier looked like he wanted to disappear, and the French girl was trying to usher her group away. "Hey, Corporal," Jones called out. "Do you move when a real officer gives you an order, or are you part of the architecture?" Still nothing. "Look at him," Jones said, his voice rising further. No reaction. "This isn't military service. It's a community theater with better costumes." A few tourists had stopped now, some filming with their phones, others simply curious about the noisy American. The other guards in the formation remained utterly motionless, but there was a subtle tension in their posture. It was the tension that arises when one of their own is targeted, but they can do nothing. "We have infantry doing real work back home," Jones continued, now truly finding his stride. "Patrolling hostile territory, making life or death decisions, risking their lives, and you're here playing dress-up for tourist cameras, collecting photos like some kind of military mascot." It was then that someone else moved. Across the courtyard, a man in a simple military uniform had paused his walk. Lieutenant General Arthur Hayes shouldn't have been here, but he was now frozen in place, staring at something that chilled him to the bone. That piece of fabric under Ward's glove. Dark green against the red wool of the tunic, markings almost black on the faded material. Hayes had seen that pattern before, in classified documents, in post-operation reports of operations that technically didn't exist. His jaw tightened as he watched the young lieutenant blithely continue his performance. Hayes had read about men like Ward, had signed orders sending them to places that appeared on no map, doing work that would never make the evening news. He began to stride towards the group, his steps measured but firm. The cadets sensed him approaching first. Like sensing the approach of a storm front. A pressure in the air that causes it to feel different and small. Living things seek shelter. The American lieutenant was still talking, still playing to his audience, when Hayes reached the rope barrier. He didn't announce himself, clear his throat, or demand attention. He simply stood there for a moment, scrutinizing the man in ceremonial dress with an intensity that caused the surrounding chatter to die down. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet carried the weight of absolute authority. "Corporal," he said, not quite conversational, yet far from commanding. "Where did you get that patch?" The courtyard had fallen silent. Even the tourists sensed something important was happening, though they couldn't say what. The clicking of cameras slowed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the pigeons seemed to have entered a watchful quiet. Michael Ward could not turn his head. He could not look at the general. The rules governing ceremonial duty were absolute. No movement, no acknowledgement, no break in composition. But the question had been asked, by one with the authority to ask it, and it deserved an answer. His voice came out steady, factual, as if reading map coordinates from memory. "Corridor Blackwood, Tarin Valley, Unit C7. The words hit General Hayes like a physical blow. He had read those operational reports, some with his own signature on them. He had even helped draft the cover stories explaining why some assets had been lost, why some areas had been devastated, why some personnel had simply vanished from official records. But he had never expected to encounter someone who had lived through what happened in that corridor. "My God," he said, almost to himself, his words spreading into the suddenly fallen silence. "That wasn't supposed to be survivable." Behind him, Jones's arrogant smile had vanished completely. He looked around for someone to explain what was happening, but no one was paying him any attention. The self-assurance had drained from his face, replaced by the slow, painful realization that he had blundered into something far larger than he understood. The German cadet who had tried to stop him earlier now stood at stiff attention, his face pale. The French cadets were completely silent, their earlier discomfort having morphed into something close to horror. Hayes moved even closer to the rope, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, yet still audible to the growing crowd. "I read the report on Corridor Blackwood," he said, his words heavy with classified knowledge. "You were pinned under rubble 12 hours before QRF reached your position. Communications were lost 6 hours after the engagement began. There was no air support, no medevac, no relief coming." Ward did not reply. He could not break his stance. One of the American cadets, who had earlier laughed and filmed, cleared his throat. His phone dangled forgotten by his side. I think we should salute him, sir." Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved as close to the ropes as protocol allowed, standing at attention with the precision of someone who had done so for 40 years, and raised his hand in a formal salute, slow, resolute, lasting longer than any regulation required. This was not part of any ceremony or sanctioned by any manual. It wasn't something seen in tourist areas where cameras record everything. Yet, Hayes held it, his eyes fixed on the man who had once single-handedly held a collapsing compound, and who now guarded something greater than tradition, more vital than grandeur. When he finally lowered his hand, his voice was quiet, yet clear enough to carry across the stone-paved courtyard and into the silence that had settled over everything like a benediction. If Corporal Ward chooses to stand here in silence, he has earned that right 100 times over. And if anyone else has an issue with his service, they can come explain it to me personally. These words echoed through the courtyard, settling into the gaps in understanding, crystallizing into a sudden, sharp awareness that some things were too important to be mocked. Behind the rope, the cadets had straightened without being ordered. Some stood at a modified attention with hands clasped behind their backs. Others simply bowed their heads. The mockery from earlier felt as if it had happened years ago, in another place, to different people who had yet to learn what respect truly looked like. Jones stared at his boots, his jaw working as if trying to swallow something bitter. When he finally looked up, his voice was no more than a whisper, all the confidence from his earlier performance gone. "Corporal Ward," he said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. I'm sorry. I truly am." Ward gave no reply. He could not break his stance, nor could he acknowledge the apology, nor could he make it easier for a young officer who had just learned a lesson that would follow him for the rest of his career. Yet the apology hung in the air, received by a silence that felt more courteous than words, more forgiving than anger. Nearby, a child tugged at her mother's coat, her small voice cutting through the adult tension with a clarity only children possess. "Mommy, what is that soldier guarding?" The woman looked at the silent figure and read, understanding something she had not moments before, seeing the man and the burden he carried beyond the uniform and the ceremony. "Not the palace, darling," she said softly, her voice seemingly thick with unshed tears. "Something far more important than that." Michael Ward stood there, as if carved from stone. This was not just a stance, it was a testament. Proof that some stories speak louder than words, that some sacrifices cannot be measured by any commendation, but can only be honored by a silent reverence and an eternal memory. Sergeant Michael Ward, under the scorching London sun, in that square where soldiers stood motionless and history seeped from the walls, was not merely a sentry. He was a living conduit of past, present, and future. Every mark he bore, every scar, was an insignia of an invisible battle, of forgotten heroics, and of sacrifices that were never told. He was the army's symbol, the nation's guardian, and the silent voice of the fallen. Sometimes the most powerful statements, the greatest lessons, are delivered without any fanfare, simply through a quiet presence. Michael Ward's stance was the embodiment of this truth. As Lieutenant General Hayes slowly walked away from the parade ground, Jones and the other cadets were still under the profound influence of Ward's silence and Hayes's words. A sense of shame had replaced Jones's earlier mockery, keenly felt. His eyes were still fixed on that small green insignia barely visible through Ward's glove. It was no longer just a piece of fabric to him, but the key to a history that needed to be remembered, learned, and respected. In that moment, Jones understood that military service wasn't just about modern technology and tactics. It was also about an ancient tradition, a code of honor, and the ability to grasp where the true strength of some men originated. For Jones, this was a deeply transformative moment. He would never forget the lesson of this day. Throughout his life, in every new assignment, that shocking day, the embodiment of a young lieutenant's hubris, would remain vivid in Jones's memories. He had heard a sound deeper than any battle cry in Ward's silent stance. This sound had taught him that respect is paid not just to rank, but to the purity of the soul and the invisible depths of heroism. In Jones's mind, Ward was no longer just a ceremonial figure but a monument, a living legend. This experience would shape his future leadership, profoundly impacting his decisions and his perspective on people. From that day on, whenever Jones saw a military uniform, he would no longer see just the fabric and insignia, but also the invisible stories beneath them, the silent sacrifices, and the untold courage. The tourists slowly dispersed. The courtyard gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but it was not as it had been before. Something in the air had changed. Perhaps it was the silence everyone had briefly shared, perhaps the unexpected revelation of a story, or simply the realization of the incredible burden carried by this silently standing soldier. Some tourists whispered, while others looked at their phone videos, trying to grasp the gravity of the moment. They had witnessed not merely a guard, but perhaps heroism itself. This moment would be the most unforgettable part of their London trip, for it was not just a sight, but a touch upon an emotion. The cameras this time had recorded not only colorful uniforms but also the depth of the human spirit beneath those uniforms. Even the children, though unable to fully grasp it at their age, sensed that they had witnessed something beyond an ordinary display. This silent lesson had left an indelible mark on the minds of the crowd, a mark that would be remembered years later, passed down from generation to generation. Many would recount that day's experience to their own children and grandchildren, teaching them how a soldier could be a hero not only with sword and rifle but also through silence, honor, and sacrifice. Michael Ward stood in place, as if carved from stone. His breathing was regular, his posture impeccable, his gaze distant yet fixed as if guarding an invisible world within. He was not there for any medal, honorary title, or public recognition. He was there for others to remember, to learn, to respect. For him, this was not merely a sentry duty but an act of worship. A silent oath to his lost comrades, Corner Blackwood, Tarin Valley, Unit C7, and to all those who had not had the chance to survive that hell. Every breath he took, every motionless moment, was a prayer for remembrance. Standing in that traditional attire, in the heart of London, he proved that the greatest acts of heroism are sometimes the quietest. Ward's stance, more than simply fulfilling a duty, represented a philosophy of life, a dedication, and the resilience inherent in the deepest layers of the human spirit. Every muscle in his body, every trauma he had endured, every fine line on his face, spoke of the invisible weight he carried and the extraordinary strength he exhibited despite it. He was a living history, carrying the whispers of the past, delivering a silent lesson to future generations. This stance challenged the speed and superficiality of the modern world, demonstrating that true values transcend time and noise. Michael Ward was not just a royal guard, he was the very embodiment of honor, duty, and unwavering commitment. The sun began to set over London's buildings. Long shadows stretched across the parade ground, as if to envelop this silent heroism along with the last remnants of the day. As the gleam of the square diminished, a melancholic play of light began on the stones and buildings. Michael Ward's watch finally ended. He was relieved by another guard. This time, the silent change, usually accompanied by an ordinary stillness, felt even heavier. The two figures, one carrying the weariness of a finished watch, the other the gravity of a duty begun, stood side by side for a brief moment, then Ward slowly withdrew. Ward's steps were measured, but now seemed to carry even more weight. He moved steadily towards the rear of the square, a shadow ready to disappear into the crowd. Behind him, the people, now scrutinizing with more observant eyes, no longer saw just a uniform. They saw a story. A symbol of heroism. They were now a conscious, more deeply thinking crowd. As Michael Ward silently walked away and vanished from sight, he left behind not just a physical void but also a powerful legacy of meaning and lessons. He was a figure walking among the public, yet far from ordinary, clad in an invisible armor of heroism. He had completed his duty, but his mission would endure forever. He didn't turn back, didn't look around. He needed no validation for the sacrifices he had made in his life, the horrors he had endured, the sorrow he carried. His mere presence was a statement in itself. Some men die on the battlefield. Some in hospitals. And some, by standing silently on guard. Each equally honorable, each equally important. Michael Ward stood there for the memory of his lost comrades, Corner Blackwood, Tarin Valley, Unit C7. His silent stance was proof that some stories speak louder than words, screams, or even medals. This was the embodiment of true strength, dignity, and unwavering discipline. It was also a message to future generations. True heroism is not about making headlines or becoming the subject of films, but about that deep commitment and loyalty that resides in every soldier's soul. His silent sacrifice would teach more than hundreds of textbooks. Thus, even if Michael Ward remained nameless in the pages of history, he would live on eternally in consciences and spirits. His legacy would reside not in official documents but in silent moments, in the shame of a young lieutenant bowing his head, in a mother's tears, and in the admiration in tourists' gazes. This would be an eternal lesson passed down from generation to generation, that appearances are deceiving and that true strength lies in internal discipline. Michael Ward's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the profound impact of silent heroism, which is deeper than even the loudest victories. His watch had ended, but what he guarded, memory, honor, and duty, would exist forever.